A chill wind drifts through the narrow cobblestone alleys of a 19th century city. Gas lamps cast long, flickering shadows. The air smells of coal smoke, damp wood, and something faintly sweet. A sugary promise offered by a ragged child tugging at your sleeve, holding out a bright candy for pennies. You reach out, tempted. But behind the swirl of sugar lies a history far darker than you imagine. Welcome to the hidden underworld of Victorian junk food. You might picture Victorian sweets as quaint, innocent toffees, simple gingerbread, perhaps fit for a nostalgic bedtime tale. But reality was far uglier. Food was cheap, mass-produced, adulterated, and often lethal. Those bright, tempting treats were loaded with fillers, poisons, and chemicals chosen not for flavor, but for profit. Bread, the staff of life, was bulked out with chalk, plaster, ground-up bone, sometimes harmful alum. Confectionery was colored with lead, mercury salts, copper compounds, bright, dazzling toxins meant to catch the eye of hungry children. In the smoky markets and crowded slums, honest starvation coexisted with lethal abundance. Working-class families, surviving on a few pence per day, had little choice. They ate what was cheap, filling, and, if they were lucky, not immediately fatal. But not immediately fatal is the problem. Chronic poisoning, digestive collapse, stunted growth, disease, this was the hidden cost. And sometimes the danger was terrifyingly obvious. In 1858, in a grim episode later dubbed the 1858 Bradford Sweets Poisoning, a batch of peppermint lozenges was accidentally laced with deadly arsenic trioxide instead of the innocuous DAF, a flour-like plaster substitute used to stretch sugar. The result? Over 200 people fell ill, around 20 died. One mislabeled barrel, one poor mix-up, and a community sweet tooth turned into mass tragedy. So why tell junk food horror stories from the Victorian era? Because it matters. Because when you bite into something that's cheap and sweet, you expect harmless pleasure, when, for those people, you were gambling with toxins, malnutrition, decay. Behind the rosy nostalgia lies desperation, greed, and death. Stick with me, dear viewer. By the end of this series, your midnight snack will feel a little safer. Plus, if you're lying in bed wondering how people could constantly, unknowingly nibble poison, this video might just help you drift off with a shiver rather than a craving. So, if you like twisted history, strange truths, and a little grim bedtime storytelling, hit that subscribe button and let Boring Owl guide you through 14 chapters of Victorian food nightmares. Once you see what junk food really meant back then, you'll never look at candy the same way again. Welcome to the darker appetite of the past. The Victorian love affair with sugar didn't begin with a single moment. It crept in gradually, like fog sliding along riverbanks at dusk, settling into every corner of the city until no household, no matter how poor, escaped its sticky charm. By the mid-19th century, sugar had shifted from an elite luxury to something shockingly common. And that sudden flood of sweetness didn't just change diets, it reshaped lives, teeth, health, and entire communities. You might imagine it as a harmless indulgence, a spoonful here, a sweet bun there, but in the Victorian world, the rise of sugar came with sharper edges than anyone expected. Picture a cramped London street on a gray morning. Market stalls crowd the pavement. Fishmongers slap their wares onto wooden boards. Costermongers shout prices of bruised apples. And somewhere between them, a vendor sells treacle-coated candies, the color of weak sunlight. Children swarm around the stall like moths to a flame. Coins clink. A sticky taffy stretches from a boy's fingers in long golden threads. This was the new everyday luxury, sweetness at last affordable for the working poor. But how did sugar get so cheap so fast? The answer, as always, lives in industrial ambition and a little human stubbornness. For centuries, sugar was expensive, a delicacy kept behind locked cupboards in middle-class kitchens and sugar cones wrapped in caper to prevent theft by servants. But then came improvements in refining, massive plantations in the Caribbean, international trade networks finally catching speed, and a growing industrial appetite back in Britain. As supply soared, price plummeted. By the mid-1800s, even someone earning a few shillings a week could buy a small bag of sweets without fainting at the cost. For a population living on bread, potatoes, weak tea, and whatever scraps they could stretch across a week, sugar was a miracle. It tasted good, it offered a quick burst of energy. It soothed hungry children. It masked the bitterness of stale bread or thin porridge. It gave a small, comforting illusion of luxury in a world overflowing with coal dust and overcrowded tenements. For many, sugar felt like a little doorway out of misery, a cheap ticket to a sweeter moment in an otherwise bleak day. But, as with most cheap tickets, there was fine print, and the Victorians didn't read it. The more sugar slipped into daily meals, the more it began reshaping bodies in ways no one fully understood yet. Tooth decay became rampant, so common that having blackened, crumbling teeth wasn't a sign of poor hygiene, but simply being alive in the 19th century. Even children barely old enough to walk had mouths ravaged by early forms of chewy, sticky Victorian treats. Sweetened teas became the drink of choice for industrial laborers who needed a quick stimulant to push through another 13-hour shift. Women added syrups to pastries. Men drank sugary ales and cordials, and children spent their pocket change on boiled candies tinted in charming but suspiciously bright colors. All the while, the sugar industry kept expanding, shaping demand with almost the same confidence as the factories shaping the city's skyline. Shop windows became miniature shrines to syrupy abundance. Rows of sweets glistened like stained glass windows, lemon drops, barley sugars, toffees, fruit pastels, gumdrops, lozenges, even cough candies that contained absolutely nothing medicinal. Bakers used sugar to disguise old flour or thinly stretched dough. Cafes drizzled treacle on anything remotely edible to create the illusion of richness. And every year, people bought more. But the real change wasn't happening in the shops. It was happening inside the body. The human digestive system had never experienced sugar on this scale. Suddenly, instead of a rare treat, it became a daily staple. Victorian stomachs, already strained by poor quality bread and limited access to fresh produce, struggled to keep up. Children developed a sweet tooth that never seemed to rest. Adults found themselves craving sugar without understanding why. It was a slow-building phenomenon, like a tide rising inch by inch until the shoreline disappears. And of course, sugar did not travel alone. It invited friends, or enemies, depending on your viewpoint. Bakers used alum and chalk to whiten poor-quality flour so their bread looked more respectable. Confectioners added bright metal-based dyes to their sweets so they would appear more enticing on crowded streets. The cheaper the treat, the more suspicious the ingredient list became. Though no one carried ingredients lists back then, naturally. You bought what the vendor handed you, and you hoped it didn't kill you. But in this first chapter of our journey, we focus on the sugar itself, the innocent-looking building block of an unforeseen health crisis. Imagine a Victorian coal worker finishing a long shift, lungs clogged with soot, muscles aching. He stops at a tea stall and drinks a scalding cup so oversweetened it tastes more like syrup than tea. It's a cheap comfort, something warm to banish the chill of the fog settling over the city. But he does this every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times, because the sweetness gives him a jolt of energy. Small, fleeting, but necessary. It keeps him upright. Now imagine a child in a slum, clutching a few farthings earned selling flowers or sweeping steps. The candy stall glows like a beacon. She buys peppermint humbugs tinted with copper-based green dye. She doesn't know what copper is, but she knows she's hungry, and the humbugs last longer than a piece of bread. So she sucks on one throughout the day, savoring the sweetness, even as the chemicals begin their slow invasion. Copper poisoning wasn't dramatic. It didn't spill you to the ground instantly. It crept in. Stomach pains, weakness, nausea. Symptoms brushed aside as the usual. And then there were families. Mothers sweetened everything to keep children quiet. Fathers ate sugary buns on the way home from work. Everyone took teaspoons of treacle as if it were a vitamin. The more sugar embedded itself in meals, the more it replaced foods that actually contained nutrients. The richer classes experienced this too, but they offset their sugar consumption with meat, vegetables, dairy, and other nutritious foods. For the poor, sugar wasn't extra. It was often the only pleasant thing they ate. What no one realized was that the human body was slowly being rewired. Energy spikes, followed by crashes. Malnutrition hiding behind plump faces. Teeth breaking, rotting, disappearing. Internal systems working overtime to process mountains of calories with almost no vitamins attached. Sugar made people full, but it wasn't feeding them. The irony is that sugar seemed so harmless, so cheerful, so childlike. It felt like the one reassuring thing in an era marked by disease, slums, long working hours, and bleak prospects. Yet it played a quiet role in draining vitality from those who needed strength the most. For every child who nibbled a sweet with delight, another child lay awake at night with stomach pangs caused by the very same treat. For every factory worker who used sugar-laden tea to power through exhaustion, another found that his body was slowly giving out under the weight of nutritional insufficiency. The Victorian sugar craze wasn't just a cultural shift, it was the foundation of a dietary crisis, a subtle one, a chronic one, a sweet one, but a crisis nonetheless. By the end of the 19th century, newspapers had begun to mutter about tooth decay, weakened laborers, and the mysterious decline of physical health among the urban poor. Doctors noted the strange paradox of underfed but sugar-fueled bodies, thin yet frequently sick. Campaigners worried that a generation raised on sugary treats, adulterated bread, and chemical dyes might not withstand the physical demands of adulthood. They were not wrong. But to the people themselves, sugar remained a comfort, a pleasure, a harmless luxury in a life with so few. They couldn't see the creeping consequences, not yet, and even if they could, many wouldn't have cared. When life overloads you with hardship, a small sweetness can feel like salvation, even if it carries a hidden cost. This chapter is the beginning of that unfolding cost, the shift from rarity to addiction, from luxury to necessity, from sweet indulgence to silent health disaster. Sugar had taken root in Victorian society, quietly altering bodies and habits. It would take decades before anyone truly understood how deeply the sweetness had soaked in. And this is where the trouble truly begins. If sugar was the Victorian public's sweet distraction, then bread was their daily anchor, the thing they trusted, depended on, and assumed would never betray them. Bread was supposed to be safe, honest, familiar. It was the quiet companion of every meal, the sturdy background character that didn't need applause. But in the 19th century, even bread had secrets. And those secrets were not the poetic, charming kind. They were the sort that made your stomach tighten, your bones weaken, and your health crumble one crumb at a time. The Victorian poor ate a lot of bread, far more than any other food. It was the cheapest, most filling option available, and it stretched across every meal of the day whether you wanted it to or not. Breakfast? Bread. Lunch? Bread. Dinner? Bread, with a smear of something, if you were lucky. In many households, especially those with several children and only a few coins to spare, bread made up most of their calories. But that would have been fine if the bread were actually bread. It wasn't. As sugar consumption rose and coaxed people into craving sweetness, bread became the quiet casualty of capitalism. Bakers, especially those operating in crowded urban neighborhoods, were under pressure to keep prices as low as possible. Families couldn't afford fancy loaves, and bakers knew it. So they stretched dough the same way Victorian landlords stretched every inch of space in tenements. Too far, without concern for consequences. Flour was expensive, fillers were cheap, and so a new culinary tradition was born. Bread that barely remembered what wheat looked like. Let's picture a typical scene. A small bakery in a narrow alley, its window fogged by the heat of the ovens. A line of women stands outside, baskets on arms, waiting for the daily loaves to be handed out. They don't get to choose from a wide selection. There is no artisanal sourdough, no multigrain option, no freshly milled whole wheat advertised in calligraphy. There's just bread. One type, one price. And everyone takes it without question, because bread is bread, right? Not quite. The flour inside those loaves often carried a cast of unwanted characters. Chalk, for instance. Not the pleasant kind you used to draw hopscotch squares, but powdered chalk that made the bread look whiter and more refined. Chalk wasn't deadly, which was convenient for bakers, and it filled space that should have been occupied by real grain. Then there was alum, a pale powder that strengthened weak dough and kept it from collapsing like a tired laborer on a Sunday afternoon. Alum made bread feel springy, deceptively firm. It also caused stomach cramps, constipation, and long-term digestive issues that Victorian doctors chalked up, no pun intended, to weak constitutions. Ground bones showed up too. Bone meal gave a kind of dusty softness to the crumb and added bulk without adding cost. Some bakers even used plaster, yes, the same plaster used on walls, to extend flour supplies during shortages. The goal was simple. Make the bread look bigger, whiter, smoother, more luxurious, more refined than it truly was. And because the poor wanted to feel a touch of refinement, they bought it. They didn't know that the whiteness came from powders scraped from walls or floors or imported in unmarked sacks. It's easy to judge in hindsight. But imagine living in a cramped tenement with 7 children and wages that vanished faster than a candle burning near an open window. Bread was the only dependable thing standing between your family and hunger. You weren't debating ingredients, you were hoping the loaf you bought today didn't shrink by morning. And if you were truly poor, you didn't even get bakery bread. You bought seconds, the leftover ends and scraps sold at reduced prices. Or you bought bread from street sellers who might have picked it out of rubbish piles, scraped it clean, and refurbished it by brushing the outside with water and flour paste. Some sellers even revived stale bread by steaming it, making it soft for a few hours, just long enough to convince someone desperate. So how did this toxic loaf parade even happen? Partly because of the booming population. Cities exploded with newcomers seeking work, and demand for cheap food soared. Industrial mills could barely keep up. Wheat prices fluctuated wildly. Transport delays, poor harvests, and economic downturns created gaps in the market. And where gaps exist, exploitation tends to slip in without knocking. Another problem was that most consumers were illiterate or lacked the time and energy to investigate what went into their food. Even if you could read, labels didn't exist. Regulations were minimal. Ingredients lists were a luxury no one had thought of yet. Bakers could mix anything into dough and still call it bread, and no one would stop them unless someone got violently ill. But the additives often didn't kill quickly. They just quietly damaged bodies over months and years. That slow decay made enforcement nearly impossible. A child might suffer stomach pain every week, but who would suspect the bread? Bread was supposed to nourish, not harm. The appearance of the loaf mattered more than the truth behind it. The Victorians loved white bread. They associated whiteness with cleanliness, status, and quality. Darker bread, wholemeal or rye, was considered food for the poor or even animals. So bakers worked overtime to whiten their product. Chalk made it lighter. Alum made it firmer. Refined sugar helped with browning and flavor. Suddenly, even low-quality bread had an appealing golden crust and a pale interior that tricked people into believing they were eating well. But the body is difficult to deceive. Digestive systems reacted badly to these imposters. Constipation became common enough to be considered normal. Children complained of stomach aches so frequently that parents stopped taking the complaints seriously. Workers found themselves fatigued even when they had eaten. Some developed chronic digestive issues that shaped the rest of their lives. Yet no one blamed the bread. They blamed themselves, their weak stomachs, the cold weather, or bad luck. Even more unsettling was how bread combined with the rising sugar culture described in Chapter 1. Together, adulterated bread and cheap sweets formed a dietary trap. People filled up on substances that looked like food but barely nourished them. They drank sugary tea that spiked their energy, then crashed. They ate chalk-filled bread that filled their stomachs but starved their cells. They snacked on bright candies that delighted the senses while quietly depositing chemicals the body couldn't process. And because no one truly starved, the illusion of normalcy remained. No one noticed how the population's strength was fading. Doctors did, eventually. They began complaining about the poor physical condition of the working classes. They noted that teeth were crumbling earlier, bones breaking more easily, and digestion issues spreading faster than they could diagnose. But medical knowledge was limited, and the idea that food might be responsible still felt radical. Most physicians blamed poor air, damp housing, or hereditary weakness. The bread stayed innocent in their eyes, a loyal companion that couldn't possibly be the culprit. But behind the scenes, small investigations were brewing. Curious chemists began testing samples from local bakeries. Their reports read like comedic horror. One loaf contained more chalk than an entire schoolroom. Another contained clay, sand, and something described only as miscellaneous grit. A particularly ambitious sample included ground limestone, probably shoveled directly from a quarry. These findings caused brief outrage, then faded from public discussion because outrage didn't fill stomachs. When you're hungry, you accept the world as it comes. And that's what Victorian families did. They sliced the bread, dipped it in tea, fed it to their children, toasted it by the fire, and packed it in cloth for long days at the factory. Bread was life. Bread was comfort. Bread was the thing you relied on when nothing else was certain. You knew the landlord might raise rent. You knew your employer might dock wages. You knew disease might sweep through the neighborhood. But you didn't expect betrayal from something as humble as bread. Yet betrayal was exactly what they got. Still, even the worst bread served an emotional purpose. It made meals feel complete. It softened the bitterness of thin soups. It quieted crying children. It created moments of fake satisfaction in a world that rarely offered real comfort. And so people clung to it, even as their bodies quietly protested. Meanwhile, bakers continued cutting corners because corners were all they had left to cut. Each crumb carried a small compromise, and those compromises added up. Weakness, fatigue, bone problems, digestive issues, all wrapped in a warm loaf that smelled perfectly innocent. The Victorians didn't stand a chance. They trusted bread. And trust, once broken, doesn't heal quickly. This chapter is the story of that trust, how it was built, stretched, and ultimately broken in slow motion. The people didn't realize their bread was betraying them, and even if they had, they wouldn't have had the means to change it. Bread was bread, life was life, and survival didn't leave space for questions. What they didn't know, what we now see clearly, is that bread was only the beginning. The real nightmare, the full tapestry of Victorian junk food, was much larger and far stranger than a loaf laced with chalk. If you've made it this far, congratulations! You've survived Victorian junk food long enough for us to wander deeper into the marketplace of questionable culinary decisions. By this chapter, you and I have already accepted that hygiene was more of a suggestion in the 1800s, chemistry was a lively guessing game, and snack makers displayed the same level of caution you'd expect from a bored raccoon rummaging through a toolbox. But the Victorians weren't done surprising us yet, not even close. So settle in, breathe a little slower, and let your body sink into whatever pillow-adjacent surface you're currently on. Because the next layer of this edible chaos gets stranger, greasier, and somehow even more bizarre. Now, if you picture Victorian street food vendors, don't imagine charming little stalls with clean counters and warm lighting. Imagine smoke, shouting, mud, questionable buckets, and the general ambiance of a medieval alleyway wearing a cheap 19th century costume. Food was often displayed openly, right in the reach of flies, who probably considered themselves paying customers. Anything that wasn't covered gathered a fine dusting of soot, horse particles, and the mysterious city flavor that London air generously provided. People back then genuinely believed this was normal. Or if they didn't believe it, they tolerated it, because hunger is a powerful negotiator. Tonight, let's talk about a snack that should have come with a warning label, a legal disclaimer, and maybe a small prayer. It was the Victorian version of fried street food. Crispy, cheap, easy to hand out, and somehow always prepared by someone who seemed suspiciously eager to feed you. Fried goods were a beloved treat, especially in poorer neighborhoods, where a few pennies could buy you something warm that tasted like food if you squinted your imagination. But the ingredients? That's where things get interesting. Batter wasn't always made with flour. Sometimes vendors used chalk dust, clay, or powdered plaster to make it stretch a little further. They told themselves it was harmless. You, however, would likely tell yourself it tastes like wall and regret. And we can't forget the oil. Modern cooking oil is, well, oil. Victorian frying oil, however, had the lifespan of a mythological creature. Vendors reused it day after day, boiling it until it darkened into a shade that didn't exist in nature. If the oil wasn't bubbling like a witch's cauldron, they weren't satisfied. And you, as a modern sleeper-watching viewer, might be relieved to know that at least the heat killed most things. Not all things, just most. It was a gamble. Everything was a gamble. One popular snack was fried eel. Londoners adored eel because it was cheap, abundant, and difficult to poison, until humans invented creative new ways to do it. Eels hauled up from the Thames came with their own seasoning of industrial runoff and a hint of unidentifiable shimmer. But Victorians fried them anyway, dipped them in their clay-enhanced batter, and served them with pride. People lined up for them. They ate them on the go, at home, after work, and sometimes during work if the shift supervisor wasn't looking. And for a moment, the greasy, salty warmth made life feel slightly less exhausting. That's the strange charm of Victorian snacks. They were dangerous, questionable, unpredictable, and beloved. Next to the fried eel stalls were sellers offering a Victorian delicacy known as scraps. Scraps were bits of leftover fried batter from other foods, swept together, refried, and sold as their own snack. It was basically the Victorian version of mystery nibbles. Whatever dropped off the pan, fish, potatoes, unidentified shapes, became part of the mix. Children loved it. Adults loved it. The bacteria probably loved it the most. And now that we're fully inside the Victorian snacking neighborhood, let's wander toward something that requires a different sort of courage: street pies. Not the nice, wholesome pies you may imagine. These pies were known for questionable fillings, cheap meats, and a general uncertainty about what was actually inside. In crowded cities, demand for fast, portable food was high, so pie makers cut corners, deep, reckless corners. Corners so sharp they could injure you. Rats? Sometimes. Stray cats? It happened. But more often, it was simply the lowest possible grade of meat, bits that couldn't be sold anywhere else. The polite term was offcuts. The realistic term was whatever was left after the butcher sighed loudly and gave up. Meat that sat too long was scrubbed with vinegar and optimism. Then it was minced into anonymity, mixed with spices, and tucked into thick pastry to keep the smell from escaping. And somehow, against all odds, people genuinely enjoyed them. Vendors shouted their prices in the streets, balancing trays of pies on their heads while navigating the chaotic crowds. Steam rose from the crusts like a Victorian miracle. A warm pie could comfort you on a cold night and distract you from the daily stress of soot, noise, and the fact that nearly every snack you consumed was slowly trying to teach you a lesson in biology. Speaking of snacks that doubled as mild hazards, sugary treats deserve their moment. Candy was incredibly popular among children, mostly because it was cheap and brightly colored. But the pigments that created those cheerful colors were sometimes borrowed from substances better suited for painting ships. Greens came from copper compounds. Yellows came from lead-based mixes. Bright reds? Occasionally mercury salts. Children happily licked them, blissfully unaware that the pretty color came with a side of body-wide rebellion. Vendors truly didn't mean harm. They just believed a pop of color helped business. They weren't wrong. Unknowingly dangerous, yes, but also not wrong. And let's not forget the popular snack known simply as toffee. The good news, real sugar was involved. The bad news, sugar was expensive, so most toffee was stretched using low-quality treacle, dirt-cheap molasses, or any sweetener adjacent syrup vendors could find. The texture ranged from pleasant chewiness to something that could remove a filling. If you didn't have cavities before eating it, the toffee took that as a personal challenge. Now, imagine yourself standing in the middle of a busy Victorian street. Lantern light flickering against brick walls, the smell of coal drifting through the air, and the sound of vendors calling out deals on foods that really shouldn't be eaten in the dark where you can't inspect them. Each snack has its own personality, its own suspicious charm. And as you wander through the chaos, you can't help appreciating how creative Victorians were when it came to stretching ingredients and ignoring consequences. This world wasn't built on safety. It was built on convenience, improvisation, and desperation wrapped in pastry. Every bite carried the thrill of survival, the promise of warmth, and the unspoken understanding that the snack might fight back later. But in a strange, sleepy way, that unpredictability becomes almost soothing. Like listening to a storm outside your window, knowing you're safe indoors. As long as you're watching this from your bed, or drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming, Victorian junk food becomes less of a threat and more of a historical bedtime story with questionable seasoning. And now that we're settling into this strange culinary past, chapter by chapter, the path ahead gets even more intriguing. Because as wild as fried foods and mystery pies were, the Victorians had some even stranger snacks up their sleeves. Snacks that push the boundaries of what counts as edible, safe, or at least not actively rebellious. By the time we step into the world of Victorian drinks, the refreshments meant to wash down all that suspicious street food, you may start to feel a strange sympathy for the people of the era. Not a comforting sympathy, more like the sort you feel when watching someone attempt a DIY project using instructions written by a sleep-deprived raccoon. Refreshments should soothe, cleanse, or at least taste like something vaguely safe. But Victorian beverages had their own personality, and that personality leaned heavily toward chaos. If Victorian snacks were mildly hazardous, their drinks were the supporting villains, quietly waiting in the background with a dramatic cape and questionable motives. Now, as you settle your head against your pillow and let your breathing slow just a touch, imagine following a tired Londoner walking into a crowded street stall after a long day. Their shoes are muddy, their lungs are filled with a tasteful blend of fog and coal, and all they want is something cool, sweet, and refreshing. What they get instead is whatever concoction the vendor has decided counts as a beverage that week. And this is where we meet Victorian lemonade. Victorian lemonade was not the cheerful, sunlit picnic drink you may be picturing. It was not squeezed freshly at the counter by someone wearing an apron and humming a tune. Most lemonade, sold cheaply on the streets, contained no lemons. Sometimes it contained no fruit at all. What it did contain was citric acid, water from a pump with a mild personality disorder, and a generous sprinkle of whatever sweetener the vendor could source without alarming their supplier. Sugar was expensive. So street vendors used substitutes, some safe-ish, some quite troubling, and some so creative they'd violate a modern food regulation by simply existing. Chalk powder helped with the cloudy look. Alum helped sharpen the taste, though it also politely shrank your insides. And the bright lemon yellow color came from pigments that, well, let's just say modern paint companies would recognize them immediately. People drank it anyway. London summers were hot, and thirst is a stubborn thing. And the first cold sip did feel refreshing, right up until your body filed a formal complaint. But lemonade wasn't the only drink trying its best with the wrong ingredients. One of the most common beverages was something known as swanky. It was a homemade mixture of water, sugar, ginger, and whatever else happened to be lying around the kitchen that morning. Fermentation was more accidental than intentional, but the final result had a pleasant fizz. The problem came from the jars used to store it. Sometimes old medicine bottles, sometimes chipped ceramic jugs, sometimes metal containers that politely donated a faint metallic twang. Every sip had a surprise. That was part of the experience. And then, of course, there were the infamous Victorian tonics. Tonics were supposed to restore the body, strengthen the nerves, improve the blood, and various other claims that had the scientific rigor of a horoscope written by someone holding a feather quill and a strong sense of confidence. Vendors swore these drinks would solve headaches, improve digestion, enhance mood, calm the spirit, and probably fix your posture while they were at it. But tonics were often little more than flavored water enhanced with ingredients that shouldn't have been enhanced. Some contained iron shavings. Apparently, someone decided you could simply drink more iron into your bloodstream. Others contained sulfur. A few boasted mysterious botanical extracts, which could mean anything from harmless herbs to plants that made your tongue ask difficult questions. The real charm, though, came from the bright, decorative bottles. People trusted the bottles. They looked official. They looked medicinal. They looked like something that belonged in a doctor's office rather than a vendor's apron pocket. But the drinks inside ranged from odd but tolerable to deeply philosophical consequences. Now, if you thought the Victorians only struggled with drinks pretending to be healthy, let me introduce you to a category far more unpredictable: cheap beer. Beer was a daily staple, not because people wanted to be slightly tipsy at breakfast, but because water wasn't always safe, and beer was at least boiled at some stage. But beer was also taxed, regulated, and surprisingly expensive for poorer families. So brewers, small-time ones especially, found clever ways to stretch their supply. Clever ways, that is how we will politely phrase it. Some added molasses to darken the color. Some added burnt sugar to imitate aging. Some added roasting compounds that helped with flavor but didn't necessarily come from edible sources. A few added stimulants to make the drink livelier, which is a delightful euphemism that tells you nothing and everything at once. And then there was small beer, a very low-alcohol brew meant for children and laborers. In theory, it was safe. In practice, its quality depended entirely on the brewer's moral compass, and Victorian moral compasses varied dramatically. Imagine taking a sip of small beer brewed in a city basement. The air is humid, the barrels are old. A single lantern lights the room, casting warm shadows across the walls. The brewer claims it's the finest batch he's ever made. And it certainly is, if your baseline for comparison is swamp water with confidence issues. Still, people drank it daily. They trusted it. They needed it. And in an age when water could betray you at any moment, beer, regardless of how oddly flavored, felt dependable. As we drift onward, let's stop at the Victorian equivalent of soda fountains, mineral water shops. These shops sold carbonated drinks infused with mineral salts. When done correctly, they were refreshing. When done incorrectly, they tasted like someone dissolved a handful of coins into a glass and called it fashionable. But Victorians adored them because the fizz felt modern. Fizz felt scientific. Fizz felt like a small miracle, bubbling right in your cup. Vendors created flavors meant to impress: lavender, violet, lime, mint, and sometimes more experimental attempts that tasted suspiciously floral, metallic, or both. Some bottles exploded without warning, which added an element of excitement to the shopping experience. And now, gently, as you rest deeper into your bed, we approach the strangest beverage of all: milk. Victorian milk should have had its own cautionary tale carved into stone. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially in busy cities. So sellers diluted it, strained it, reheated it, and sometimes added ingredients that preserved it more in spirit than in fact. Chalk was common; it thickened milk nicely. Sugar sometimes made it taste fresher. And in rare cases, people added starch or plaster dust to restore body, which is an interesting phrase considering what it did to the human body afterward. Children drank it regularly. Families purchased it daily. And everyone pretended not to taste the quiet tragedy happening in the cup. But despite everything, every chalky lemonade, every unpredictable tonic, every bottle of milk trying its best with very limited help, the Victorian world kept spinning. People adapted. They learned to trust their favorite vendors, to avoid certain stalls, to listen for subtle clues. A vendor who smiled too widely was suspicious. A drink that smelled too sweet was off. A tonic sold from a cart with a wobbly wheel was, by default, a risk. Yet, the drinks existed. They thrived. They were part of daily life, shaping routines, warming hands on cold mornings, cooling exhausted workers in the heat, and offering brief, soothing moments in an otherwise loud, smoky world. And here you are, drifting through that world from the safety of your pillow, exploring each taste and texture like a calm, cinematic dream. Nothing can harm you here. These drinks are only stories now, faded flavors carried through time, softened into gentle reminders of how far we've come. By now, you and I have wandered through enough Victorian snacks and drinks to understand one basic truth. The era was determined to test the limits of what the human stomach could negotiate. And by negotiate, I mean bargain, plead, and occasionally stage a quiet rebellion. But nothing truly reveals the Victorian relationship with food quite like the powders, preserves, and enhanced products that lived quietly on pantry shelves. These weren't street foods or flashy market temptations. These were the everyday items, the things families bought weekly, trusted wholeheartedly, and unknowingly wrestled with behind the scenes. So, as you settle even more comfortably into your bed, let the blankets sink around you like a warm fog. Let the world get a little softer around the edges. Because Victorian pantry staples were a strange blend of ordinary and unsettling, and there's something strangely soothing about exploring them from a safe distance. Let's begin with bread. A simple, innocent food, right? Well, in the Victorian era, bread was a full-time job of disappointment. Good flour was expensive. Bad flour was cheap. And millers and bakers were human beings with rent, families, and a remarkable willingness to experiment. This is how we ended up with bread whitened using alum, a substance that, while very effective at making flour look clean, also made bread dense enough to double as a minor self-defense weapon. Victorians loved white bread because it looked pure. They did not realize that the purity was chemical theater. Children ate this bread daily. Workers brought it with them to factories. Housewives toasted it over small kitchen fires. And no one noticed that their food was, in essence, lightly powdered with ambition. Sometimes chalk was added to bread as well, or plaster, or crushed bones. Bakers weren't trying to harm anyone. They were trying to survive in a competitive marketplace where customers expected beautiful, pale loaves for pennies. So they did what humans always do when resources run tight. They pretended. Imagine a mother slicing into a freshly baked Victorian loaf, the crust warm, the smell comforting. She spreads a bit of butter, hands a slice to her child, and never imagines that inside the softness is a generous sprinkle of repurposed wall. Because why would she? Bread is supposed to be safe. Bread is the gentle, universal food. Bread is the background character in every meal, except in the Victorian era, where it casually auditioned for the role of chaotic neutral. Now, let's move on to something you may already suspect was a problem: spice. Victorian spices were aspirational. They wanted to taste like the real thing. However, these spices were often bought in bulk from sources with flexible business ethics. Turmeric was sometimes mixed with lead compounds to brighten the color. Cinnamon could be stretched using ground nutshells. Black pepper was frequently patted out with burnt toast crumbs or tiny stones, which I suppose added texture, if nothing else. Families sprinkled these spices into stews, pies, and puddings, unaware that their seasoning blend included the subtle crunch of Victorian creativity. Spices weren't just flavors, they were optimistic guesses. And now, drifting gently through this world where pantry items have secret lives, we arrive at preserves. Victorian preserves were a beloved comfort. Every home had jars of jam or marmalade tucked away. Fruit was expensive, so preserves were a luxury. But, as always, luxury has loopholes. If a jam looked too pale, vendors added red dyes made from questionable minerals. If fruit was scarce, they stretched it with apple pulp or mashed turnips. Yes, turnip jam existed. And no, the customers weren't informed. Sweeteners varied widely, depending on what a seller could afford that season. Real sugar was rare. Cheap syrups were abundant. And if the jam fermented slightly in the jar, people simply stirred it and carried on with their lives. Households spread it across toast, mixed it into porridge, layered it into cakes. And once again, no one questioned anything. The Victorian approach to food safety was, essentially, if it doesn't bite me first, it's probably fine. Speaking of porridge, oatmeal was a staple across classes. It was cheap, filling, and easy to store. But oats, when poorly stored, attracted guests, little wriggling ones. And Victorian pantries weren't equipped with airtight containers. People skimmed the surface, shrugged, and cooked it anyway. Hot water solves everything, right? Or so they believed. Porridge was served steaming, thick, comforting, and accompanied by a quiet hope that boiling temperatures erased all sins. And then there was sugar. Sugar today is a straightforward substance, white, clean, predictable. Victorian sugar was brown, gritty, and mixed with everything from sand to ground limestone to stretch profits. Refining sugar was expensive, so vendors often helped it along with whatever substances resembled crystals. Housewives dissolved the sugar into tea, noticing the odd sediment at the bottom of the cup, but writing it off as normal. It was a time when people trusted their suppliers in the same blind, earnest way we trust the best before date on packaged snacks. Let's gently glide into another everyday item: butter. Butter was rarely pure. Sometimes it was fresh. Sometimes it was resurrected. Spoiled butter could be washed, salted heavily, and sold again. Sellers mixed cheaper fats with real butter to create blends that sort of looked right and vaguely tasted correct if you distracted your senses. Butter was precious. People used it sparingly, spreading thin layers on bread that already contained half a chalkboard's worth of minerals. Now, imagine a Victorian kitchen. Dim yellow lantern light, wooden shelves lined with jars, a loaf of slightly suspicious bread on the counter, and a pot of porridge simmering on the stove. A mother hums as she cooks. A child sits at a small wooden table swinging their legs, waiting for breakfast. Everything looks calm. Everything looks normal. And that's the gentle horror of Victorian food. It hid its dangers quietly, politely, without ever raising its voice. And just when you think we've reached the end of pantry mischief, we must address the grand finale of Victorian essentials: tea. Tea was sacred. Tea was ritual. Tea was the national beverage to fix every hardship from a cold morning to a social crisis. But tea leaves were expensive, and the temptation to stretch them was irresistible. Used tea leaves, sometimes from hotels or wealthy households, were collected, washed, dried, dyed, and resold as fresh. The dyes included iron salts, copper compounds, and things that stained hands if you touched the leaves too long. The average Victorian woman poured boiling water over these leaves each morning, believing she was making a simple cup of comfort. Instead, she brewed a mixture with the faint personality of a freshly painted fence. And still, life went on normally. The food tasted good enough. People didn't question it. They had bigger worries: rent, work, illnesses, street pollution, social expectations. Food fraud was part of the background noise of daily living. So, as you rest deeper into your bed, drifting comfortably, there's something strangely peaceful about this entire journey. Because from the safety of your pillow, Victorian pantry items become almost charming. They're historical quirks. They're distant stories. They're echoes of a time when people truly believed they were doing their best with what they had. And you? You're simply drifting through their world like a quiet observer, untouched by their troubles, wrapped in a blanket of modern food safety and soft evening calm. As we drift further into the Victorian world, you and I have already explored the pantry shelves, street corners, drink stalls, and everything in between. By now, you've probably realized something important. The Victorians were not trying to poison themselves. They simply lived in a time where cutting corners was part of the culture, and regulations were more like polite suggestions whispered from a distant committee no one could hear over the sound of horses, factory whistles, and daily survival. But there is one area of Victorian life that ties all of this together in a way that's both unsettling and strangely fascinating: the kitchens themselves. Victorian kitchens were the beating heart of each home. Whether it was a wealthy townhouse, a cramped worker's flat, or a countryside cottage leaning ever so gently toward collapse. And these kitchens were filled with tools, methods, shortcuts, and traditions that shaped what people ate and how safe it was to eat it. So, lie back a little deeper, breathe slowly, and let your mind drift through the warm, smoky haze of a 19th century cooking space. There's something almost soothing about stepping into a room that tried its best, even when its best involved questionable choices. Let's start with the most important tool in the kitchen: the stove, or, more accurately, the fire. Fire burned constantly in Victorian homes, tucked into iron ranges that never quite heated evenly. One part of the stove could scorch your hand, while another part barely warmed your tea. Cooks worked around it like dancers, learning the hot spots by instinct. And because soot gathered everywhere, food always carried a faint whisper of smoke, even if it wasn't supposed to. Imagine a cook preparing dinner. She leans over the iron range, her face glowing from the heat, her apron dusted with flour that may or may not contain a suspicious amount of chalk. The pot she's stirring has been simmering for hours, partly because the recipe demands it, and partly because she's trying to kill anything in the ingredients that shouldn't have been there in the first place. A practical approach. But the real chaos comes from the ingredients stored in the kitchen. Flour sat in barrels, attracting moisture and little visitors. Dried herbs hung from ceilings, slowly fading into muted, dusty versions of their former selves. Meat sat on counters for longer than modern food safety guidelines would ever tolerate. And because no refrigerator existed to save the day, cooks relied on instincts, smell, temperature, and occasionally prayer. This was especially true when cooking meat. Victorian butchers sold cuts that ranged from decent to you'll never guess which section of the animal this used to be. Meat aged quickly without refrigeration, so families bought what they could and cooked it immediately. If the weather was warm, that urgency doubled. But in poorer neighborhoods, people couldn't afford fresh cuts, so they boiled everything. Boiling was the universal solution. If the meat smelled odd, boil it. If it looked slightly off, boil it. If it moved, well, boil it harder. Boiled dishes were everywhere. Boiled beef, boiled mutton, boiled potatoes, boiled puddings. The kitchen often smelled like a permanent steam cloud, with hints of animal fat. And yet, despite all this boiling, the results didn't always reach the levels of sterilization one might hope for. But people ate it anyway, grateful for the warmth and fullness it provided. Now, let's turn to another household staple, pies. Pies were the great equalizer of Victorian cuisine. Rich families filled them with game meats, mushrooms, and fine spices. Poor families filled them with scraps, vegetables, and whatever protein the butcher had conveniently forgotten to label. Kitchens became assembly lines of dough rolling, filling, stirring, and crust sealing. But Victorian ovens were temperamental creatures. A pie could come out perfectly baked at the top and raw at the bottom, or vice versa. The cook's trick was to rotate dishes throughout the cooking process, listening carefully to the crackling fire and hoping the temperature balanced itself without any surprises. But the most unpredictable element in a Victorian kitchen was milk. Milk spoiled faster than anyone wanted to admit. The moment it entered the house, the race began. Cooks heated it, churned it, baked it into puddings, and mixed it into porridge at a pace that suggests they knew deep down they were working against time. Mysterious textures, interesting smells, odd curdling, these were normal occurrences. People adapted, adding sugar or spice to mask suspicious flavors. It didn't always work, but it made breakfast more interesting. And then there were the miscellaneous additives that became kitchen staples simply because they were cheap and convincing. Artificial sweeteners made their way into puddings. Coloring agents found their way into sauces. Even basic ingredients like vinegar sometimes came from diluted or improvised sources that bordered on enthusiastic improvisation. One particularly questionable staple was lard, used for frying, baking, greasing pans, and anything requiring fat. Good lard was a luxury. What most families had access to was, let's call it, rustic. Stored in containers without lids, scooped with spoons that weren't always clean, and reused liberally, lard held flavors from every dish cooked that week. You could taste breakfast from Tuesday in the crust of Saturday's pie, and somehow this was considered normal. Victorian kitchens also battled pests, mice, insects, or whatever creature found the floors warm and the crumbs plentiful. People stored flour in barrels with lids, but the lids weren't always tight. People covered dishes with cloth, but cloth didn't stop everything. Cooks simply learned to sweep, shake, sift, and carry on. Not ideal, but survival rarely follows ideal conditions. And through all of this, something beautiful happened. Meals brought families together. Kitchens were crowded, warm, noisy spaces filled with chatter, laughter, sighs, and the crackle of burning wood. Children sat near the hearth, watching their mothers cook. Husbands came in from work, wiping their boots and sniffing the air for hints of dinner. Even when the food was unpredictable, the ritual was steady, comforting, familiar. Now settle deeper into your blankets, because this next part becomes strangely gentle. Despite all the hazards, Victorian cooks were resourceful. They made stews that warmed entire homes. They baked breads that filled rooms with comforting smells. They created puddings that made children smile. And they did it all with tools that rattled, ingredients that misbehaved, and ovens that had more personality than accuracy. A Victorian kitchen wasn't malicious. It was simply doing its best with what it had, much like the families who depended on it. And there's something surprisingly relaxing about imagining furniture with history. Shelves of jars, flickering light from coals, and the rhythmic sound of a cook stirring a pot or kneading dough. In the soft glow of the firelight, it all becomes less hazardous and more charmingly chaotic. And from your bed, with your modern food standards and neatly labeled ingredients, the whole scene becomes a safe little bubble of historical curiosity, a world that feels distant, charmingly imperfect, and oddly peaceful when viewed from afar. By the time we reach this point, you've traveled through streets lined with fried eel and mystery pies, peeked into kitchens where milk curdled like an uninvited guest, and watched pantry shelves quietly plotting their own mischief. And yet, despite all that, there is one aspect of Victorian junk food that deserves its own quiet, dramatic sigh. Sweets. Candies, toffees, and confections that dazzled the eye and delighted the tongue, while quietly waging war on the digestive systems of unsuspecting Victorians. It's a chapter in itself because sweets were simultaneously a source of joy, a symbol of status, and a minor public health disaster wrapped in brightly colored paper. So, nestle back, let the blankets weigh gently on your shoulders, and allow your mind to wander through candy shops that existed long before any health inspector dared to enter. The Victorian sweet tooth was formidable. Children adored candy, and adults, despite what they might have said, weren't far behind. Street vendors shouted their offerings from every corner: boiled sweets, licorice, jellies, and small handcrafted chocolates. There were sugar sticks that gleamed like thin crystals, coated almonds that glimmered under gas lamps, and peppermint drops that were, in theory, refreshing. But behind every colorful exterior lay a tangle of curiosity, chemistry, and occasional chaos. Take boiled sweets, for example. Simple, hard candies made from sugar and flavoring seem harmless today. But in the Victorian era, sugar was expensive. Bakers and candy makers needed a way to stretch it. Sometimes they used chalk or powdered alum to make the candy harder and more uniform. And color? Oh, the color! Red came from lead-based pigments or cochineal bugs. Green from copper compounds. yellow from something closer to paint than food. Each candy was like a little edible experiment, a gamble of flavor, texture, and chemical courage. And people ate it anyway. Children licked the candy, oblivious to the metallic whispers that accompanied every bite, their parents reassuring themselves that joy was worth the risk. Then there were toffees, soft, chewy, sticky, sometimes delightfully sweet. But even here, economy reigned supreme. Molasses replaced sugar when it was scarce. Cream was stretched with water. Vendors reused caramelized sugar that had cooled and hardened, then melted it down again, creating a cycle that would make a modern health inspector faint. The Victorians called it frugality. Modern historians call it culinary chaos disguised as sweetness. And chocolates. Oh, the chocolates. Limited in supply, painstakingly made by hand, each small piece was a luxury. But not all chocolates were equal. The lower-cost versions used cocoa mixed with powdered sugar, fillers, and sometimes even ground nuts or other mysterious ingredients to bulk them up. Children cherished these treats, holding them like tiny treasures in small, calloused hands, unaware that the ingredients occasionally included non-food elements that made them slightly educational in a scientific sense. Each bite taught resilience, if nothing else. Jellies and fruit pastes deserve a passing glance, too. Fruit was expensive, and jelly making required sugar. So confectioners got creative. Pectin, when it existed, was unevenly sourced. Substitute gums, starches, and thickeners appeared frequently. The resulting confections were sometimes rubbery, sometimes fragile, sometimes a sticky combination of the two. They were not modern dessert in any sense of the word, but they brought happiness, which, for Victorians, counted for something. And sometimes they even delivered a flavor vaguely resembling fruit, which was miraculous enough in its own right. Licorice, for all its fame, wasn't particularly safer. Extracted from the root, it was sometimes flavored with sugar, sometimes with powdered substances designed to enhance bulk, sometimes with colorants that defied simple categorization. The chewiness was meant to give children something to occupy their mouths, but often ended up testing teeth and patience simultaneously. Adults, who sometimes indulged after a long day at work, found the same chews equally challenging, their sharp edges scraping gums in a reminder that Victorian treats were never entirely gentle. But sweets weren't purely street-bound. They also existed in homes, tucked into cupboards, spooned into puddings, or crumbled over porridge. Housewives, eager to please children and guests, experimented with recipes that combined sugar, butter, flour, and dubious flavorings. Recipes from books might call for candied fruits that were, at best, a questionable interpretation of fruit, or nuts that had traveled through multiple hands and dusty roads before landing in a mixture meant to comfort. Even the act of baking was a small exercise in chemistry. Ovens heated inconsistently. Sugar caramelized unpredictably. Jams, marmalades, and preserves ran, bubbled, and occasionally exploded in the heat. Every dessert was a careful negotiation between warmth, chemistry, and hope. And let's not forget the cultural layer. Victorian society equated sweetness with celebration, status, and reward. A well-made pudding or a jar of proper jam signified care, effort, and domestic competence. Serving these to guests was a sign of taste. Sharing with children was an expression of love. Sweets were more than food. They were a statement. But even as they carried this symbolic weight, they were fundamentally flawed. The imperfections weren't hidden, they were ignored. They were accepted, adapted to, even celebrated. And in that acceptance lay a quiet resilience. Now, there's a subtle danger here, but it's almost poetic. All of these sugary treats, candies, toffees, chocolates, jellies, added calories, excitement, and pleasure. They gave children a break from the monotony of bland bread, overboiled vegetables, and watered-down milk. They gave adults a fleeting sense of indulgence in a world where comfort was rare. And yet, beneath the bright colors, shiny wrappers, and sticky fingers, these sweets also taught endurance. They tested digestive systems, patience, and the ability to trust food. Every bite was both a delight and a lesson. And that is part of the strange, almost lullaby-like charm of Victorian confections. They are dangerous, yes, but they are also oddly comforting when viewed from a distance. The risks are historical, the flavors imagined, and the chaos reduced to a story you can safely watch while lying in bed. You can taste them in your mind without consequence. You can watch the children lick sugar-streaked fingers and smell the warmth of ovens without ever facing the threat of powdered alum in real life. It's almost meditative. By now, you may notice a rhythm in all this chaos. Streets full of fried eel and mystery pies, pantries overflowing with powders and preserves, kitchens humming with fire and steam, and finally, the delightful sweetness of candies and toffees. Each element interacts with the next, creating a tapestry of taste, hazard, and human resilience. And it's a rhythm that carries its own quiet satisfaction, a historical lullaby that can calm even the most restless mind. And yet, despite all of this, there is still more to uncover. Sweets are delightful, drinks are adventurous, pantries are chaotic, and kitchens are inventive. But the deeper, darker corners of Victorian junk food remain. There are lessons yet to learn, curiosities yet to explore, and small, unsettling truths that can only be understood by stepping further into the era, one chapter at a time. By now, you've wandered through kitchens filled with smoke and steam, explored pantries stacked with powders and preserves, lingered at street corners where fried eel and mystery pies ruled the day, and even indulged in the bright, sticky world of Victorian sweets. You've seen the creativity, the resilience, and the quiet chaos that defined an era of food unlike anything we know today. But if you think sweets, drinks, and bread were the only culprits, you haven't yet met the category that could be called the convenience hazards, foods sold with convenience in mind, but delivered with mischief in every bite. Let's begin with a familiar one, biscuits. Not the buttery, carefully baked treats you might picture on a modern tea tray. Victorian biscuits were an entirely different experience. They were cheap, shelf-stable, and designed to last longer than any stomach should comfortably allow. Flour, sugar, and fat formed the basic structure, but often they included additives designed to preserve texture and color, chalk, alum, starches, and occasionally the unexpected grit of a poorly sifted batch. Biscuits were often sold in paper wrappers, which offered minimal protection. They were carried in pockets, tossed into baskets, and sometimes swept off the floor before purchase. And yet, despite all these risks, they were a staple snack for children and adults alike, filling tummies during long workdays or school sessions. Tea-time biscuits and sweet crackers weren't the only biscuits making their rounds. Gingerbread biscuits were a particular delight, often flavored with exotic spices that were expensive and therefore frequently adulterated. Cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg were sometimes mixed with fillers to extend supply, leading to an aroma that promised warmth and spice, but occasionally delivered grit, dust, or, in rare cases, faintly metallic notes. Victorian bakers had a talent for turning scarcity into innovation. Some might call it cunning. Others might call it reckless optimism. Now, let's wander toward another curious category: canned goods. The canning process was relatively new in the Victorian era, and it promised convenience, preservation, and a degree of safety for foods that might otherwise spoil quickly. But innovation always comes with growing pains. Metal cans were often sealed imperfectly. Lead solder, while effective at keeping air out, also occasionally leached into the food. Vegetables and meats were preserved with salt, vinegar, or brine, but sometimes the brine was more chemical than culinary. And yet, people embraced canned goods enthusiastically. They were modern, practical, and allowed families to store something resembling a prepared meal without constant attention. The risks were hidden, subtle, and generally accepted as part of the adventure. Victorian jams and marmalades, which we've mentioned in passing, also deserve another look in this context. Fruit was expensive, sugar was precious, and the jars themselves often came with optimistic labeling rather than guaranteed contents. A jar of strawberry jam might contain more apple pulp than fruit, with colorants added to mimic ripeness. Marmalades sometimes carried the essence of oranges, but also whatever peel or pulp was available, processed quickly and tossed into boiling sugar to disguise any imperfections. These spreads were not only a delight, but also a quiet test of endurance, a gentle hazard disguised as breakfast comfort. Then there were preserved meats, sausages, potted meats, and cured hams. Salt and smoking were the preservation methods of choice, and sometimes additional substances were added to maintain color or firmness. Sausages were stuffed with offcuts, fillers, and occasionally improvised flavorings to cover any unpleasant aromas. The Victorians called these practical and economical. Modern palates might call them imaginative. And yet, families ate them, grateful for protein that was at least vaguely edible and often warming when added to stews. Street vendors also played their part in this category of convenience hazards. Pre-packaged snacks, sometimes wrapped in paper and sometimes handed out directly from trays, offered quick energy for workers, school children, and anyone passing through. These snacks were often fried, sweetened, or salted, with ingredients that varied from batch to batch. One day, a fried potato snack might taste perfect. The next day, the oil might have been reused too many times, or a batch of flour might have included dust or grit. The unpredictability was part of the charm, or terror, depending on how you looked at it. And of course, one cannot overlook pickles and chutneys. Acidic, flavorful, and sometimes exotic, these condiments promised to elevate meals that might otherwise be bland or questionable. But the acidic nature of pickling couldn't always overcome poor hygiene. Jars were often washed in shared water, knives were reused without proper cleaning, and the brine sometimes carried surprises. Yet people embraced pickles for flavor, tradition, and the assurance that at least something on the table offered excitement in every bite. What ties all of these convenience hazards together is a philosophy: functionality over perfection. The Victorians needed food that could travel, be stored, or consumed quickly. Appearance mattered more than safety, and affordability dictated every choice. From biscuits to canned goods to preserved meats, the pattern is clear: a little risk, a lot of practicality, and a pinch of improvisation. And it worked, at least most of the time. Most families survived, adapted, and even thrived within these culinary boundaries. Yet, from the safety of your bed, these foods take on a softer, almost whimsical character. Imagine walking down a Victorian street, basket in hand, the sun low in the sky, the air filled with smoke, coal dust, and the faint aroma of frying fats. Vendors call out their wares: biscuits, canned goods, preserved meats, pickles, and chutneys. Each offers warmth, sustenance, and subtle adventure. Every bite is a story, a test, a small gamble. And as you watch this scene unfold from your cozy vantage point, it becomes almost charming. The hazards are historical, the chaos is contained, and the curiosity of it all is gentle enough to drift off to, like the soft closing of a storybook. But even as we appreciate the ingenuity and resilience of the Victorians, it's impossible to ignore a subtle tension running through these convenience foods. They are the link between the street chaos of fried snacks, the sweetness of candies, and the safety, questionable as it may be, of pantries and kitchens. They connect each chapter of this culinary tale, showing us how the Victorians relied on creativity, improvisation, and a delicate tolerance for risk to survive in a world that didn't yet understand food safety. From your pillow, you can imagine the rhythm of it. Street vendors calling, kitchens humming, cupboards stocked with powders and preserves, children sneaking biscuits, adults sipping tonics, and a world that somehow managed to persist, adapt, and even thrive despite the odds. It's a strange, gentle chaos, a lullaby of history, wrapped in smells, textures, and tastes that no longer threaten you, but entertain, intrigue, and soothe. And as you rest, drifting closer to the edge of sleep, know that the story of Victorian convenience foods is far from over. There are still meals to explore, treats to examine, and subtle, fascinating hazards awaiting us in the next chapter. Each link in this culinary chain adds depth, color, and texture to the larger narrative, a world simultaneously bizarre, hazardous, and quietly comforting. By now, you've drifted through Victorian kitchens, pantries, streets, sweets, drinks, and convenience foods. You've met fried eel, mystery pies, chalk-laced bread, dubious tonics, and candies that doubled as science experiments. But even after all this, there remains one quietly terrifying corner of Victorian eating that deserves its own spotlight: the world of flavored snacks, syrups, and novelty treats that promised excitement, sweetness, or medicinal benefits, but often delivered a complex combination of chemistry and chaos. Settling back, let your blanket cocoon you like the quiet fog of a gaslit London street, because these snacks are as curious as they are historic, and entirely safe for you to explore from the comfort of your bed. Let's start with a category that sounds innocent, even cheerful: flavored syrups. Victorian children loved them. Adults enjoyed them too, often as a quick way to sweeten tea, porridge, or even just water. They came in bright bottles with cheerful labels, claiming tastes from cherry to raspberry, lemon to violet, or sometimes more exotic imaginings like tropical fruit that had probably never seen a warm breeze. The truth, of course, was often far more chaotic. The syrups were thick, sticky, and surprisingly potent. Many contained sugar or molasses as a base, sometimes watered down to stretch supply. Colors were added from mineral or botanical sources, many of which would be considered alarming today. And flavors? A mix of natural extracts, powders, and generous guesses. Drinking a glass of raspberry syrup was, in essence, a gamble with taste. Candy makers had a similar approach with novelty snacks. Gumdrops, pastilles, and boiled sweets were crafted to intrigue. Some contained real flavoring, some were colored with bright minerals. Many were designed to last weeks, months, or longer in cupboards without losing texture. But this durability came at a cost. The chemicals that preserved shape and color could react in strange ways over time. A candy that was pleasantly chewy on Monday could be rock hard by Wednesday, or faintly metallic, and still they were adored. Children collected them, traded them, and occasionally dropped one on the street, only to retrieve it later with an unflinching sense of optimism. Then there were medicinal snacks, which were as delightful as they were bewildering. In a time when medicine was limited and quackery was rampant, candy often doubled as cure. Licorice sticks promised to soothe coughs. Sugary lozenges advertised relief from sore throats. Syrups claimed to balance the body's humors or strengthen the nerves, but ingredients varied wildly. Herbs, extracts, sugar, and sometimes more unconventional compounds found their way into these little sweet medicines. A parent might hand a child a soothing lozenge with a quiet hope that it worked, or at least didn't hurt, and the child would pop it into their mouth with trust, curiosity, and a hint of delight. It's worth noting that presentation played a large role in all of this. Candy shops often featured bright jars, neat labels, and cheerful designs meant to attract attention. And in the streets, vendors displayed their goods proudly, balancing trays of colored treats on their heads or sliding them across counters with practiced flair. It was theater, marketing, and hazard all rolled into one, and the Victorians loved it. The visual spectacle, the novelty, the tactile experience of sweet treats, these were as important as taste, sometimes more. Let's wander into the territory of small batch baked goods, which often existed somewhere between sweet snack and minor culinary gamble. Victorian households frequently made their own cakes, puddings, and small pastries, using recipes passed down through families or borrowed from cookbooks. Ingredients were measured with practical approximations, ovens were heated with fire rather than thermostats, and baking times were suggested with phrases like "until golden brown" or "until done," which left a lot of room for interpretation. A cake could emerge slightly undercooked, slightly overcooked, or perfectly in the sweet middle. Families celebrated successes and quietly tolerated failures, knowing that even imperfect treats offered comfort. One particularly whimsical corner of Victorian snacks were the jelly sweets, gelatin-based candies molded into shapes, sometimes flavored, often brightly colored. Gelatin was derived from animal sources, sugar was abundant when affordable, and flavors were improvised. These candies offered visual delight and tactile engagement, but textures could vary from rubbery to brittle, and storage was tricky. Gelatin was sensitive to temperature. A warm kitchen could turn it into a sticky mess, while a cool one might leave it almost unchewable. Eating these sweets was a mild adventure, a tiny gamble in a world where candy could be anything but predictable. Even fruit-based treats carried their own quirks. Candied peel, dried fruits, and small fruit pastes were often heavily sugared to preserve them. But sugar alone wasn't enough. Colors were often added, textures enhanced, and occasionally non-fruit fillers crept in to stretch supply. A slice of candied orange could be a treat or a challenge, depending on the batch. And yet, the Victorians adored them. They appreciated the effort, the flavor, and the symbolism of enjoying a rare treat, even if it involved minor compromise in quality. Another fascinating aspect is the combination of snack categories. A small treat could serve as dessert, reward, and medicine simultaneously. A boiled sweet might alleviate a cough, brighten a child's day, and provide a quick sugar boost for a laborer. The multi-purpose nature of Victorian snacks was born from necessity, imagination, and a dash of hope. Vendors, parents, and children alike embraced this duality with curiosity and resilience. And as you lie in your bed, observing this world safely from the distance of history, there's something quietly comforting about the rhythm. Brightly colored candies, flavored syrups, novelty lozenges, small baked goods, and jelly treats all combine to create a gentle chaos, a world simultaneously charming, hazardous, and completely safe from your vantage point. It's a lullaby of taste, color, and texture, unfolding in the streets, shops, and homes of Victorian London. Even more than sweetness, these snacks reveal a cultural truth. The Victorians valued ingenuity, creativity, and delight, often over safety. They adapted to scarcity, celebrated novelty, and embraced risk with a quiet determination that carried them through harsh winters, long workdays, and the bustling, smoky streets of their cities. And from your cozy, modern perspective, the hazards melt away, leaving only fascination and gentle amusement. As the world of Victorian-flavored snacks, syrups, and novelty treats settles softly in your mind, know that there's more yet to explore. From fried foods to confections, preserved meats to pantry oddities, the story stretches further. Each chapter a new exploration of creativity, resilience, and gentle chaos in the culinary world of the 19th century. By now, you've wandered through the streets of Victorian London, peered into kitchens, pantries, and candy shops, and tasted every imagined flavor of powdered, fried, preserved, and sweetened food, all from the safe distance of your imagination. And yet, as much as sweets, syrups, and confections carried their own gentle chaos, there remains a category that truly defined the Victorian approach to snacking: fried and battered foods. These were the culinary rebels, the street-level sensations, the crunchy, greasy, hot morsels that promised delight, energy, and minor digestive suspense, all in one bite. So lie back deeper into your pillow, let your muscles relax, and drift into a world of sizzling fats, smoke, and irresistible temptation. Imagine a street corner on a sweltering London afternoon. Vendors shout above the hum of horse-drawn carts, coal smoke, and gossiping pedestrians. Fryers bubble with oil, filling the air with the unmistakable aroma of fried fish, dough, and fat. This is the world of Victorian fried snacks: fried eels, fish cakes, potato fritters, and doughy treats that might look familiar but carry a twist of historical hazard. The thrill comes not only from taste, but from the unpredictability of both ingredient and preparation. Let's begin with fried fish, a staple of the era. Eels, herring, and small white fish were commonly sold from street stalls. They were fresh, sometimes surprisingly so, or they had been kept for a day or two in conditions that modern food safety standards would find alarming. Oil was reused liberally, sometimes strained, sometimes not. Vendors worked with ingenuity, stirring, flipping, and tossing the fish with skill honed by necessity. Patrons accepted the risks because the fried fish offered warmth, nourishment, and a unique sense of comfort after a long day. Each bite was a minor adventure, a little crispy, a little smoky, sometimes a little unpredictable, but always satisfying. Potato-based snacks were equally popular. Fritters, chips, and dumplings were fried in oil or fat, then sprinkled with salt or sometimes sugar, depending on the vendor's whim. Potatoes themselves were affordable, filling, and versatile, but storage and preparation varied. Some vendors worked quickly and cleanly. Others reused oil that had already hosted multiple batches, creating flavors that were rich, layered, and occasionally ominous. People didn't mind. The texture, aroma, and immediate gratification outweighed any concern. And then there were dough-based snacks, fried pies, donuts, fritters, and small pastries designed to be portable, filling, and delicious. Victorian cooks and vendors experimented with flavorings, cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, but often stretched their ingredients creatively. Dough might include flour mixed with powdered chalk or other additives to ensure texture, and frying fat could be beef tallow, lard, or reused oil. The end result was sometimes crunchy, sometimes dense, sometimes oily, and occasionally just slightly off. But patrons ate them anyway, entranced by aroma, taste, and convenience. Street snacks weren't always sold with hygiene in mind. Vendors handled coins, food, and utensils in rapid succession. Fingers brushed surfaces, oil splashed, dust floated in from the bustling street. Modern standards would raise an eyebrow, or faint entirely, but the Victorians considered it normal, and somehow survival rates were remarkably high. Adaptation, resilience, and a digestive system hardened by necessity kept people going. But it wasn't just about practicality. Fried foods carried social and emotional significance. Families enjoyed them as treats after work or school. Children pooled their pennies for small portions, sharing bites and stories. Adults found comfort in a warm, fried snack after hours of labor. These foods were the communal currency of street life, a bridge between need and pleasure. And yet, they were unpredictable, chaotic, and inherently human, a perfect mirror of the bustling, smoky, ever-adaptable city itself. Then there's the matter of sauces and accompaniments, which added a further layer of complexity. Vinegar, gravy, or sweet syrups could transform a simple fried snack into something extraordinary, or something mildly unsettling, depending on freshness and preparation. Street vendors improvised constantly, tasting, adjusting, and hoping the next batch satisfied hungry patrons. The process was as much art as it was necessity, and it carried an underlying risk that added a subtle thrill to each bite. Fried sweets deserve a mention too. Donuts and fritters sweetened with sugar or honey were common, sometimes filled with fruit or jams stretched creatively with other pulps. These treats combined the comfort of sweetness with the excitement of fried texture, offering children and adults alike a momentary escape from the gray streets, factory walls, and daily toil. And like all Victorian foods, they carried a hint of uncertainty. Consistency varied, textures shifted, and flavors fluctuated. But that was part of the charm, part of the thrill, and part of the historical allure. Even within homes, frying was an adventure. Without modern stoves or thermometers, cooks gauged oil temperature by eye and by touch, often relying on experience, intuition, and a little luck. Overheated oil could burn, underheated oil could soak into dough. Ingredients behaved unpredictably. And yet, Victorians persisted. Meals emerged hot, crisp, and filling. Kitchens smelled of oil, warmth, and a hint of caramelized sugar. And families ate, talked, laughed, and sometimes grimaced quietly, never questioning the tiny hazards behind the deliciousness. From your vantage point, cozy and relaxed, this world becomes almost meditative. The hiss of frying oil, the aroma of cooking dough, the chatter of vendors, and the laughter of children, each element creates a rhythm. It's a story of adaptation, ingenuity, and human resilience wrapped in a layer of crunchy, golden brown delight. The risks are historical, the chaos is distant, and the comfort is palpable. But fried foods don't exist in isolation. They link the street corner chaos, kitchen creativity, pantry surprises, sweet indulgences, and convenience hazards into a cohesive tapestry. Each category informs the other, creating a complex, interconnected world of taste, texture, and survival. And it is this interconnectedness, viewed from the safety of your bed, that offers a gentle fascination and subtle calm, a historical lullaby composed of smell, sound, and imagined flavor. By now, you've wandered the streets and kitchens, tasted sweets, syrups, fried snacks, and even glimpsed the curious world of convenience foods. You've smelled the smoke of coal, the aroma of frying fat, and the sweetness of sugar stretched to its limits. And yet, there remains another layer of Victorian culinary life to explore, one that sits quietly at the edge of the pantry, lingers in shadowed kitchens, and whispers of both comfort and hazard: beverages. Not tea, not the celebrated drinks of polite society, but the curious, often questionable refreshments consumed daily by families, workers, and children alike. Imagine a street on a damp London afternoon, gas lamps flickering, puddles reflecting the gray sky. Vendors push carts, clatter tins, and shout over the buzz of conversation. Some carry bright bottles filled with cordials, sweet, thick liquids promising relief, refreshment, or medicinal aid. Others offer small cups of beer or ale, sometimes diluted with water, sometimes barely warm, always affordable, and always part of daily life. Beverages were not merely drinks. They were a reflection of social class, ingenuity, and human improvisation, all wrapped up in glass, tin, or earthenware. Let's start with cordials. Victorian cordials were concentrated syrups, often fruit-flavored, sometimes herbal, occasionally medicinal. Families added water to stretch the sweet liquid, giving children a rare treat that could be consumed safely, or at least safely enough by the standards of the time. But making cordials at home was a complex task. Sugar was expensive, fruit might be out of season, and preservation was tricky, so cooks improvised. Artificial flavorings crept in. Mineral colors appeared. Herbs were boiled to release subtle tones. The result was unpredictable. Some batches were fragrant and delicious, while others carried a strange metallic hint or unexpected bitterness. Yet the beverage's allure persisted. Its color was cheerful. Its sweetness was comforting. Its very presence was a small celebration in an often gray and tiring world. Then there were beers, ales, and mild spirits. For adults, these drinks offered calories, warmth, and sometimes a brief escape from work, worry, or monotony. Small children occasionally consumed watered-down ale under parental supervision, a practice that seems alarming now but was once commonplace. Brewers were inventive, sometimes to a fault. Storage conditions were unpredictable. Fermentation could continue in the bottle, creating bubbles, off flavors, or even unexpected strength. Yet the drinks were generally accepted, consumed, and even celebrated, forming a daily rhythm that linked work, home, and community. Another curious beverage category included hot drinks beyond tea. Chocolate drinks, often thickened with milk or water, were increasingly popular, especially for children. But milk was perishable, and chocolate was expensive. Vendors and home cooks stretched ingredients wherever possible, sometimes diluting chocolate powders, sometimes adding sugar or flour to thicken the mixture. The result was comforting, warm, and occasionally grainy, but always a treat. Children drank it after school, adults sipped it as a quiet indulgence, and the ritual provided comfort in ways that extended beyond flavor. Even water was not as simple as it seems. Victorian water supplies, especially in densely populated urban areas, were often contaminated or inconsistent. Families boiled water, filtered it through cloth, or added flavoring agents like syrup or lemon to encourage consumption. Hygiene was uneven, and yet water remained essential, revealing how even the most basic beverage carried its own subtle risk. Drinking was not merely a physical act. It was a quiet negotiation with the environment, technology, and circumstance. Soft drinks, what we might now call early sodas, also began to appear. Carbonation, naturally occurring or artificially introduced, created novelty. Bottled drinks promised excitement, sweetness, and refreshment. They were often fruit-flavored, sometimes medicinal, sometimes slightly mysterious in origin. Children and adults alike marveled at the fizz, the color, the novelty, and the sensory experience. But these drinks, like many Victorian consumables, contained variables unknown to modern consumers. Ingredients were inconsistent. Sugar levels were high. Chemical additives were used to stabilize color or flavor. The result was a drink that could delight, surprise, and occasionally challenge the digestive system, all without warning. Hot cordials, spiced drinks, and punch also played a role in social life. These beverages offered warmth on cold evenings, the comfort of spices, and the occasional thrill of alcohol, subtly incorporated. Housewives carefully stirred them, tasted them, and offered them to guests as a mark of hospitality. Flavorings varied, sugar content fluctuated, and yet the sensory experience, the aroma, the warmth, the communal enjoyment was more important than consistency. Each sip was a blend of chemistry, art, and gentle human optimism. Of course, beverages were often consumed alongside foods already rich in complexity. Biscuits, pastries, fried snacks, and preserves were paired with drinks, creating combinations that balanced sweetness, texture, and warmth. A child might dunk a hard biscuit into chocolate milk or a cordial, softening the crunch and blending flavors in a way both satisfying and unpredictable. Adults sipped ale alongside fried fish or a meat pie, and the combination created comfort in a world that could otherwise feel harsh and relentless. And there was ritual in all of this. Pouring a drink, stirring a cordial, serving a cup of chocolate, or sharing a small bottle of soda was a moment of connection. It brought family together. It soothed children after school. It provided respite for adults returning from work. Even when drinks carried subtle hazards, moldy fruit, reused water, imperfectly prepared syrups, the act of consumption was more than functional. It was human, social, and gentle in its intention. From the safe vantage of your bed, this world of Victorian beverages feels almost meditative. The clink of glass bottles, the hiss of poured hot liquid, the steam rising from cups, the faint fragrance of herbs, sugar, or chocolate, all these sensory details create a rhythm. It's a story of resilience, creativity, and quiet enjoyment, where even hazards are softened by history, distance, and imagination. And as you drift further, consider how these beverages tie together the threads we've explored. Sweets, fried foods, convenience snacks, pantries, kitchens, and street life. Each element informs the next, forming a cohesive tapestry of Victorian culinary life, one both chaotic and comforting. By this point, you've navigated the chaotic streets, smoky kitchens, crowded pantries, sticky sweets, sizzling fried snacks, and unpredictable beverages of Victorian life. You've glimpsed the ingenuity, improvisation, and occasional peril hidden behind every bite and sip. But there remains a final layer of Victorian indulgence that truly captures both the charm and danger of the era: the world of condiments, toppings, and flavor enhancers. These seemingly minor ingredients shaped taste, preserved food, and often carried hidden risks, making them central to the culinary experience of the 19th century. So, sink deeper into your pillow, relax your shoulders, and let the gentle rhythm of history guide your mind through jars, bottles, and tins that added zest, color, and a touch of chaos to every meal. Condiments were everywhere, from grand townhouses to cramped workers' homes, and even lining the stalls of street vendors. Vinegar, mustard, sauces, and pickles transformed simple ingredients into something flavorful and memorable. But while the Victorians prized taste, their methods of preparation and storage were not always predictable. Vinegar was sometimes adulterated or diluted to stretch supply. Mustard could be mixed with flour or chalk to enhance volume. Sauces might contain added coloring agents, sweeteners, or flavoring powders designed to impress visually and gustatorily. And pickles? Well, pickles carried their own quiet chaos. Brine preserved vegetables and fruit, but jars were often washed in shared water, knives reused across batches, and herbs occasionally replaced with dried, dusty approximations. The result was a flavor adventure in every bite, and an implicit test of resilience for those who consumed it. Jellied sauces were another area of intrigue. Savory or sweet, these preparations relied on gelatin, sugar, or other thickening agents to achieve their texture. They were decorative and practical, offering a way to extend flavor across multiple dishes. But gelatin was finicky, sugar crystallized unpredictably, and textures could range from pleasantly smooth to strangely rubbery. Victorian cooks adapted with experience, intuition, and a willingness to accept imperfection as part of the culinary process. Guests, children, and family members were instructed to consume with care, or at least with optimism. Let's not forget spices, which were both treasured and tricky. Exotic flavors like nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves were prized, but often adulterated. Dried herbs might be mixed with fillers to increase volume or lose potency over time. Pepper, ginger, and other spices were sometimes unevenly ground or contaminated during transport. Victorian kitchens incorporated them generously, trusting that the aroma, taste, and effort would make up for any inconsistencies. And indeed, the result was often enchanting. Dishes with warmth, complexity, and a sense of controlled chaos that modern palates rarely experience. Then there were sweet condiments, syrups, jams, and drizzles that accompanied breakfasts, tea-time treats, and desserts. Sugar, fruit, and flavoring were combined in ways designed to delight, but storage challenges added unpredictability. Syrups could thicken or separate, jam could ferment subtly over time, and some preparations included fillers, coloring agents, or unusual flavorings to stretch ingredients. Yet these minor hazards were largely accepted. The Victorians valued flavor, appearance, and ritual over perfection. Each drizzle, dollop, or spoonful contributed to the rhythm of a meal and the shared experience of dining. Even butter and spreads carried intrigue. Butter, often salted, was stored at room temperature, exposed to warmth and air. It absorbed scents, textures, and occasionally a touch of dust or grit. Spreads made from nuts, fruits, or seeds were mixed with sugar or flour to enhance volume, creating flavors that were rich, sweet, and occasionally unpredictable. Victorian diners embraced these spreads, appreciating aroma, mouthfeel, and energy, while ignoring minor hazards that today would prompt alarm. Sauces for meats, puddings, and fried foods added another layer. Gravies, thickened with flour, enriched with fats, and flavored with drippings, were central to many meals. Sauces were often prepared from leftovers, adapted to taste, and modified with available ingredients. Their consistency, color, and flavor varied from batch to batch. And yet, they were essential. They added depth, moisture, and subtle seasoning to otherwise simple dishes. Each pour was an act of care, improvisation, and gentle risk. One fascinating Victorian innovation was the mixed plate, where multiple condiments, spreads, and small sauces accompanied a meal. Patrons could sample, mix, or adjust flavors according to preference, creating personalized taste experiences. This reflected a subtle democratization of flavor. Individuals controlled portions, combinations, and intensity. But it also carried unpredictability. Too much vinegar could overpower a dish. A heavy-handed sprinkle of spice could dominate flavor. And yet, these choices were celebrated, learned from, and passed down in kitchens across the city. The connection to previous culinary explorations is clear. Just as fried foods, sweets, and beverages tested taste, resilience, and patience, condiments extended these lessons subtly. They offered risk, reward, flavor, and flexibility. They linked street foods to kitchen preparations, pantry storage to mealtime indulgences, and historical curiosity to modern reflection. And from the comfort of your bed, they provide a gentle rhythm of sensory imagination, sight, scent, taste, and touch, imagined without any danger. Victorian condiments also reveal something essential about the era itself: resourcefulness. Households, cooks, and vendors adapted to scarcity, expense, and unpredictability. Ingredients were stretched, recipes improvised, and flavors enhanced creatively. Taste mattered as much as survival. Presentation mattered as much as nutrition. And even when the result was inconsistent, chaotic, or slightly hazardous, people persisted. They enjoyed meals, shared experiences, and adapted, finding comfort in ritual, familiarity, and the occasional indulgent risk. From your safe vantage point, this world unfolds like a slow, comforting melody. The clink of jars, the swirl of sauces, the aroma of spices, and the memory of sweet, fried, or savory flavors create a narrative rhythm that relaxes, fascinates, and soothes. It's a lullaby of history, taste, and human resilience, an exploration of ingenuity and gentle chaos that can calm the mind while engaging the imagination. By now, you've explored nearly every facet of Victorian culinary life. You've walked the streets, lingered in smoky kitchens, peeked into pantries brimming with powders and preserves, and indulged your imagination in sweets, fried snacks, beverages, and condiments. And yet, there remains a final, unifying layer to this culinary tapestry: the combination of all these elements into full meals, family routines, and street-side indulgences, where creativity, necessity, and hazard intertwined into daily life. This is the chapter where the entire ecosystem of Victorian junk food and peculiar habits comes together, where chaos becomes rhythm, and where survival and indulgence exist hand in hand. Picture a typical working-class household in London. The room is small, but the hearth burns warmly. Coal smoke mingles with the scent of overcooked vegetables, frying fat, and sweet pastries. On the table, a pot of thick porridge shares space with a small tin of preserved meat, a jar of homemade jam, and a crust of bread that's slightly hard but still comforting. A child sips chocolate milk while nibbling a biscuit, and an adult dunks a piece of fried dough into hot tea. Every bite, every sip, carries flavor, comfort, and a subtle reminder that food is as much about survival and resourcefulness as it is about taste. In such homes, meals were carefully orchestrated performances of efficiency. Ingredients were stretched, repurposed, and enhanced creatively. Leftovers might be fried, stewed, or incorporated into new dishes. Spices, syrups, and condiments were used to enhance flavor and disguise imperfections. Fried fish could appear alongside boiled vegetables, a small sweet treat for dessert, and a glass of cordial or watered-down ale. Every combination carried a minor element of unpredictability. A batch of preserved meat might be slightly off, a fried fritter could be oilier than intended, a sweet might have hardened unexpectedly. But the rhythm of consumption continued, and the household thrived within these parameters. Street life mirrored this domestic creativity on a grander, slightly messier scale. Vendors combined fried snacks, biscuits, candies, and beverages into convenient packages for passers-by. A small child might clutch a boiled sweet, while a worker held a tin of fried fish, both consumed in rapid succession. Cordials, syrups, and soft drinks were offered alongside baked goods, and pickles or gravies might accompany savory snacks. The chaos of street commerce was a microcosm of Victorian culinary improvisation. Variety, risk, and delight intertwined seamlessly. At the heart of it all was the concept of adaptability. Victorians had to work within tight economic and environmental constraints. Ingredients were expensive or perishable, kitchens were primitive by modern standards, and hygiene was inconsistent. Yet, people innovated. They substituted ingredients, reused materials, experimented with preparation, and accepted the occasional minor hazard as part of daily life. Each meal became a balancing act between resourcefulness, flavor, and survival. Even when indulging in sweets or fried snacks, households were conscious of economy. A single sweet could be shared among several children. Fried dough might be sliced and repurposed into another dish. Syrups and cordials could flavor multiple meals or beverages. The Victorians understood that pleasure, nutrition, and thrift had to coexist, and their culinary improvisations reflected this delicate balance. Then there was the cultural rhythm of meals. Breakfast, lunch, tea time, and supper each had distinct traditions, even in modest homes. Breakfast might be porridge or bread with butter and jam, accompanied by a hot beverage. Lunch often involved bread, cheese, or small fried foods purchased from local vendors. Tea time brought sweet confections, biscuits, and cordial. Supper might feature leftovers, fried items, or simple stews enhanced with gravies and condiments. Each mealtime reinforced social bonds, provided comfort, and offered small indulgences that punctuated an otherwise laborious day. The unpredictability of these meals, when combined with street foods and snacks, created a subtle tension that defined Victorian food culture. Children learned patience and resilience as they navigated sticky sweets, chewy confections, and fried treats. Adults adjusted to flavors, textures, and preparation quirks with practiced calm. Every meal was a lesson in improvisation, an exercise in tolerance, and a celebration of human creativity in the face of scarcity. From your cozy vantage point, observing this all safely in imagination, the rhythm of Victorian meals can feel soothing. The overlapping aromas, textures, and flavors combine into a meditative narrative. Fried snacks mingle with sweets. Cordials temper salt and vinegar. Gravies and sauces enrich simple staples, and the occasional oddity or hazard adds intrigue. This layered, dynamic system of consumption reflects not only ingenuity, but also resilience and subtle joy. As the day fades and the streets quiet, kitchens grow dim, and households settle into evening routines, the full spectrum of Victorian culinary life stands revealed. Chaotic, inventive, slightly hazardous, and entirely human. This is the era where indulgence, necessity, and imagination coexist, forming a tapestry of taste, texture, and resilience that continues to fascinate centuries later. Here we are at the final chapter of our journey through the curious, chaotic, and oddly charming world of Victorian junk food. You've wandered streets where fried eels hissed in bubbling fat, peeked into kitchens where sugar, chalk, and molasses collided in unpredictable alchemy, lingered at pantries brimming with preserves and powders, and explored sweets, syrups, beverages, condiments, and combinations that would make any modern health inspector faint. And now, with the story almost at its close, it's time to step back, breathe, and reflect on the strange tapestry we've woven together, a world where danger, delight, ingenuity, and resilience intertwined in ways both subtle and spectacular. Victorian food was a balancing act in every sense, at once practical, inventive, and occasionally reckless. It reflected the broader rhythms of 19th century life. Families were constrained by limited resources, unpredictable ingredients, and rudimentary technology. Yet they found joy, comfort, and even luxury in the foods they could access. A child's delight at a boiled sweet, an adult's satisfaction in a fried fritter, the quiet ritual of sipping a cordial after school. These moments defined life in a city bustling with smoke, industry, and social upheaval. And, remarkably, people survived, adapted, and even thrived despite, or perhaps because of, the subtle hazards that surrounded them. If there's one lesson to draw from all of this, it is the human capacity for creativity under constraint. The Victorians stretched sugar, repurposed scraps, improvised with spices, and experimented with preservation techniques, creating foods that were at once practical and indulgent. Street vendors invented portable meals and treats, while home cooks juggled economy, flavor, and appearance with quiet ingenuity. Hazards existed, yes, chalk in bread, lead-based coloring in sweets, reused oils, questionable water, but they were managed with experience, observation, and sometimes sheer luck. Life and food were unpredictable, and survival required flexibility and resilience. And yet, for all the potential dangers, Victorian food carried a subtle charm, one that modern observers can appreciate safely from the comfort of a bed or cozy chair. There is poetry in the chaos of streets lined with fried snacks, shops overflowing with colorful candies, kitchens humming with steam and smoke, and tables set with condiments, gravies, and preserves. There is drama in the combination of textures, flavors, and aromas that defined daily meals. There is humor in imagining children clutching sticky sweets, adults navigating imperfect sauces, and families improvising dinner from whatever was at hand. It's a world that captivates because it is both chaotic and human, imperfect yet full of ingenuity. Even more, Victorian junk food offers a subtle meditation on pleasure, indulgence, and perspective. Modern viewers can observe the hazards from a distance, understanding the risks historically without experiencing them personally. This allows a quiet reflection on the courage, resilience, and inventiveness of people navigating scarcity and imperfection. A boiled sweet that once contained powdered alum becomes a charming anecdote. A fried fritter with uneven texture becomes a story of adaptation. A jar of jam with unusual consistency becomes a lesson in creativity. All are elements of a culinary world that is historically accurate, fascinating, and, from your safe vantage point, gently entertaining. The rhythm of Victorian food culture, snacks, sweets, fried dishes, beverages, condiments, and complete meals, also mirrors the rhythm of life in that era. There was unpredictability, a sense of improvisation, and constant adaptation. Yet within this chaos were routines, rituals, and small moments of comfort. A sweet treat after school, a warm fritter at a market stall, a sip of cordial on a rainy afternoon. These moments, small but significant, offered joy, connection, and a subtle sense of control in a world often dominated by work, weather, and scarcity. These moments, small but significant, offered joy, connection, and a subtle sense of control in a world often dominated by work, weather, and scarcity. And so, as this journey concludes, it is worth appreciating the artistry behind survival. Victorian junk food was not merely sustenance, it was a reflection of human ingenuity, cultural values, and an enduring spirit of experimentation. It taught patience, resilience, and adaptability, while simultaneously providing delight, indulgence, and the occasional thrill of risk. It reminds us that even in the most ordinary meals, there is potential for wonder, curiosity, and subtle humor. From your safe vantage point, nestled in blankets, you can envision the streets, kitchens, pantries, and tables of Victorian London with vivid clarity. You can smell frying fat, taste sticky sweets, imagine the hiss of boiling sugar, and feel the textures of foods that shaped an entire era. The dangers are safely historical, the chaos is controlled in memory, and the narrative is complete, a slow, immersive story that entertains, informs, and even soothes, as gentle as a historical lullaby. Victorian junk food would have been risky, sometimes unpleasant, occasionally puzzling, but always inventive and human. And now, having traced its path from street vendors to home kitchens, from sweets to fried snacks, from beverages to condiments, you can rest in the quiet knowledge that this chaotic, charming culinary world, full of flavor, hazard, and ingenuity, exists safely in imagination. You've wandered, observed, and imagined, and the story lingers softly in the mind. The streets are emptying. The ovens are cooling. The jars and bottles are resting, and the last of the sweets have been consumed. And as the quiet settles, there is a gentle satisfaction in knowing that the world of Victorian junk food, with all its hazards, indulgences, and inventiveness, is now a safe, fascinating story for you to enjoy, reflect upon, and perhaps dream about as you drift into a calm, restful sleep. And with that, the journey ends, but the story will linger, a historical lullaby of flavor, texture, and human ingenuity, ready to soothe the imagination whenever it is recalled.